well, what actually is the history of realism in writing? Like, if I were to like inhabit this perspective, if it's journalism, I think it's maybe a slightly different question, because then you're not, unless you, and this is why before we started recording, we was talking about the new journalism, kind of gonzo journalism, as maybe blurring the boundaries here, that like it isn't so easy to separate the question of art versus reportage.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Well, with me today is Stanley Sharpey. He's an editor at Sublation magazine. He is a brilliant genius man who might need a toupee, but otherwise he's doing great. And Stanley, welcome back to the Diet Soap podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me on and hitting me with that unexpected 1-2 punch. Really disoriented me right at the beginning.
Oh yeah. Well, you're welcome. So we're going to talk about the end of history and Fukuyama and where we're at and where we as a society are at in this period that is defined, I guess, by a lack of historical progress, according to Fukuyama. And you suggested that we discuss this today. I do think my feeling is that the left, in particular, and by that I mean mostly the Democratic Party, would like to assure everyone that history has stopped, and that what we're experiencing right now through the Trump administration with the tariffs and the anti-immigration policies and the bombing of Iran and on does not represent a change from the neoliberal order that had defined the last, 60, 70 years, something like that. So maybe not, maybe 50 years. But so yeah, from my perspective, to return to the end of history as an idea seems an appropriate thing to do. And I'm wondering if we can agree that history has ended in the way that Fukuyama says, and still think that Trump represents some sort of break or change or the rolling over of a new epoch.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say when you said that, I actually think the idea that history has restarted, we should talk about what Fukuyama actually means by the end of history, because, he himself seems to perpetually be getting annoyed over the next decade or so that people haven't understood what he actually meant. But I would say
can I make an effort to define what he means, and you can correct me?
Sure. Can I just finish this thought?
Yeah.
To say that history has restarted might actually be, maybe that is more aligned with the Democratic Party ideology, right? Because one way that this is framed is to say that liberal democracy, or the kind of dominance of liberal democracy, which is what Fukuyama means by the end of history, basically, is threatened by people like Trump, right? So on that account, what Trump represents is a decisive break from liberal democracy itself, which is a bit different from saying that, okay, we're entering a new phase of capitalism that might be in some way continuous with, but different from neoliberalism. It's closer to saying that, okay, he's a fascist who definitively rejects the premises of the modern world, or he's kind of more authoritarian and a liberal than your average, to the point which we've gone backwards or something, right? Whereas we might want to say that no, Trump, even if he does represent change of some kind, is not entirely, he's not a complete break from the status quo in that way, right? At least in the sense that he's not, beyond the pale.
Right. So the end of history means, you said it just a moment ago, but if history has ended, that means that we no longer have to, I'm going to quote George Herbert Walker Bush. We no longer have to stay late into the night, burning the midnight oil, pondering and arguing and writing about what's the best form of government, because we've discovered it, and it is essentially the American form of government, based on a constitutional order, individual rights, representative government, and so on. And that's the notion of the end of history, and that idea actually defines the first Bush presidency. I think it was one of the themes of his inaugural address and of his presidency, I believe. And so, when we think that history hasn't ended, there are two ways we might take it up. One is to think, there is somewhere to go beyond this form of government. That would be an improvement. That would actually meet people's needs more efficiently and help people live more full, meaningful, happy lives. That's one way to think of it. But the way that Fukuyama and Bush thought about it was, history is the continued struggle between the best form of government, liberal democracies, and challengers who are misguided, like the fascists and the communists. And what the end of history means is that there will be no future challengers, even misguided ones.
So yeah, I mean, I would say that, you can just summarize what Fukuyama means by the end of history as, we've reached a point where there are no plausible alternatives to what he calls liberal democracy. And I think we should discuss, at some point we should try and work out, well, what is liberal democracy, right? Because I think that might be one of the bigger problems with his account, is this very idea of liberal democracy. But yeah, so it obviously is conditioned by the post-Cold War moment, but his original essay, which is written in 1989, which is then developed into the long book, The End of History and the Last Man, in 1992, is obviously written before the Soviet Union actually collapses. Obviously, it's evidently in crisis, but it hasn't yet.
The Berlin Wall has come down in 1989, so there is definitely a sense that the Soviet Union is in crisis. So go on.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, so for the next decade or so, he keeps revisiting this because people keep coming to him or writing rebuttals saying, "Oh, but look at what's happening, in the former Warsaw Pact countries, or the Balkans, right? There's horrible war and ethnic cleansing, displacement going on, right? Isn't this history happening?" And but he's quite clear in the original articles and in the book that he doesn't mean that this has completely conquered the globe, and that the way he puts it is that there aren't still places which are stuck in history. Post history is not evenly distributed.
Yeah, it's uneven development of liberal democracy.
Right. And he talks about this a bit also he writes a piece after 9/11, which I think is one of the reasons why we decided to talk about this, because it came up in your discussion with Chris of your video essay on 9/11. He obviously, because this just whenever anything happens, he seems to write an essay that says, "Does this mean that history has started again?" And he always answers no. He says, "Well, has history restarted after 9/11?" But one of the ways he thinks about it there is that Europe sort of has this privilege of, it can believe that post-history has completely triumphed, because it's sort of just, it's nice and peaceful sitting there, with the EU and whatever else. And then it's the US that actually takes on the role of, making sure that this system is defended from any outside threats, and potentially trying to spread the system. So, on that account, the US has like kind of one foot in and one foot out of this post-historical situation. And that might present a problem for his broader account, because in the original book, ultimately, I mean, I think it's unclear what he thinks the sort of motor or mechanism of this is. And we should talk about that. Like, he's trying to give this kind of universal history, right? Which in the sort of classical form has some account of, well, how is this end being realized in the world? In the like Hegelian or Kantian versions, this is happening behind our backs, like not necessarily with conscious intervention, that events are kind of just leading towards this outcome, right? So he needs to find something in the world that's pointing towards that. But it might be a problem for one of his accounts of that, because he does seem to just have a faith that there's a symbiotic relationship between like economic development, democracy, and peace, right? Which is very bourgeois in a certain way, but it's like a really late, really tortured version of that sort of bourgeois worldview, long after it's probably become inappropriate. Hence, like, he is reaching back to Hegel mainly, right? That's where he's getting the idea of the end of history from. Whether he gives a good account of what Hegel is about, I'm not sure. Although I think it might be, in some ways, it might be better than some of what passes for like secondary literature on Hegel, in that he does at least see that Hegel is like a liberal and is in some way concerned with the development of freedom in history. Although that does fall out a bit in Fukuyama's account, because he ultimately falls back on this idea of recognition, right? And that's why for him, liberal democracy is kind of the discovered final best form of government, is that it affords people recognition in a way that other forms just can't. And that without that, people will remain dissatisfied.
That category of recognition is worth poking at. It because it does seem to me to be a kind of psychological account of human beings that actually posits a transhistorical need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where he kind of can't really re-inhabit the Hegelian position, right? I think it's interesting, one of the reasons I read this book is because I was like, I want to see someone trying to do a universal history, like at the end of the 20th century. Like, how are you going to do that after, 2 world wars and God knows what else? How is, it's ambitious and that's interesting. But he can't really, like you said, in the Hegelian account, there's not really a fixed human nature. Or if there is, it's only something that we realize once it's completely developed in the course of history, and we can look back and say, oh wait, that was freedom. Freedom was developing all along. And obviously saying that freedom is human nature is quite different from saying like we have X and Y particular psychological faculties. But yeah, so I think Fukuyama he basically just draws on Plato, or his reading of Plato, which I think is quite influenced by Leo Strauss. And, he just has this model of like the soul divided into several parts, one of which is this, it's called thymos, which he interprets as a desire for, I guess it's to have one's status recognized in the eyes of others. And yeah, it does seem sometimes like on his account, that is the thing that just makes history go, right? That ultimately if we do end up with liberal democracy triumphant everywhere, it will be because people just really want it. That it satisfies them in a way that other, particularly like pre-modern forms of government didn't, but also like what he refers to as, authoritarian forms of government in the modern world. Yeah, but I mean, he does also point in other. I think that's one of the interesting things, and it'd be good to relate it to your discussion of the Benjamin thesis on the philosophy of history, which does discuss this problem of universal history. Mm. And I don't know if it's in the main text itself. I think it might be in the Paralipomena. There's this line about people who try and write universal history today. It just ends up being like Esperanto, which was an attempt to develop a universal language, I think, in the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. Right. So the point there is like, it's a kind of forced universality, right? We're trying to put
right.
Humanity back together again, and it just doesn't quite work. And the other image Benjamin has is like, if you were to tell a proper universal history, you'll be running the rope through your hands and you wouldn't feel any threads fraying. It would just be smooth. But whereas when you look at like Fukuyama's narrative, it's sort of like, it feels fragmentary, right? Like it doesn't quite fit together. You have like a load of independent, you have the psychology that's driving things, you have science. It feels like a lot of very crucial events are missed out. For it to make sense. And then sometimes it just sounds like he'll just say, well, okay, the only way this is going to happen is if we strive for it and if we want it. In which case it just sounds like, okay, this is just a moral ideal, right? This isn't actually borne out by history itself. Right? And I don't think that's just a failure of thought on his part, that like he just wasn't smart enough to work it out. I think it reflects the problem of trying to do what he's doing, in 1992. I think anyone who was trying to do the same thing would probably face a similar problem. Why he's interesting is that he even tries to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just as to give another example of, the way he, tries to argue for and support liberal democracy as if it is something we must choose, is in the recent piece in the Atlantic, after the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as he defends the West or liberal democracy from opponents in China and Russia. He says, we in the West should not allow ourselves to be discouraged or to don't believe the hype coming from Russia and China. That's what he says. Mm-hmm. And that indicates that he feels that liberal democracy must be defended as an ideal rather than is by necessity going to be triumphant, I believe. But I want to point out something about my understanding of Hegel. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I read the Phenomenology years ago, and the end of the Phenomenology, as I understand it, doesn't it doesn't end with a perfect balance of recognition of all the members of society or something like that. It ends with the category of forgiveness and then the absolute. And the absolute is a recognition of the necessity of the contradiction. As I remember this, that he illustrates by pointing to Antigone, and the contradiction between what is necessary for the basically public morality versus private morality, and how both can stake adequate claim to representing the truth. And
right. So I think this is why it's, I think at the same time that Fukuyama's writing, and subsequently there have been attempts to give an account of Hegel as if his primary category was that of recognition, right? Which I think is unfortunate, because the category of recognition isn't quite the same as that of freedom.
Right.
The fact that Fukuyama doesn't take that as central means that, he never quite opens himself up to the left Hegelian development of Hegel, right? I.e. Marxism.
Right.
Yeah. So
or even others like Feuerbach.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah, right. So I think, I would say that one of the ideas, and I'm probably not the best person to give an account of this, but of the Hegelian system, is that these different parts are all basically telling the same story from different angles, right? So you have the lectures on the philosophy of world history, lectures on the philosophy of religion, lectures on the history of philosophy, right? They're not they should be consistent and unified, and that includes the phenomenology of spirit, right? They're kind of telling this from different, they're taking different ways into the same problem.
Right.
Which I do think is best. I do think the central category is freedom, and that maybe recognition loses something.
Yeah, I just want to intervene and say one thing about recognition in liberal democracies, which is that one of the complaints about liberal democracies has always been that it is too egalitarian. It abandons the old caste system, and therefore it is much harder to gain recognition. The kind of recognition you gain is maybe contentless almost, in a truly liberal egalitarian society, where your accomplishments and your professional status and your wealth, none of these things are set you above anyone else, at least not in the eyes of the law in America. And also in terms of private social life, one doesn't encounter a society where formal recognition of your caste or your status is dominates your social interactions. The idea is like a guy drives up in a Rolls Royce to the gas pump, and the gas station attendant comes out to pump his gas, and they're both equal people in the market, right? So there's no that recognition has to be mutual, and it's rather flat in a liberal democracy. And I actually think that's something that Fukuyama actually addresses, because I remember him pointing to Trump as symptomatic of an unresolved problem of recognition in liberal democracy.
Yeah, he then eventually writes a whole book on the idea of recognition. I will defend him and say that he does just follow Hegel in this respect, that he thinks that previous forms of recognition, because they do exist in, like you said, in the caste society, are just inadequate. And
they're not universalizable. Not everyone can be recognized. Is that basically?
Well, they're just unsatisfactory, because the king who is free, the one person who is free in ancient society, can in some way recognize his subjects as worthy of certain, of charity of some kind, of benevolence. But that's neither satisfying for the people who are subject to that, nor is it actually satisfying to the king, right? Because the recognition he receives in return, what is the recognition of slaves to a king? It doesn't mean anything,
right? That's the old master-slave dialectic from Hegel.
Yeah. I mean, at least interpreted purely in terms of recognition. So I think he does, he tries to uphold that, but like you said, so the danger, I think he's more sympathetic to a kind of Nietzsche critique of egalitarianism than he is the sort of left Hegelian critique of capitalism. So what that means on his account is that people will become last men. That's like the second part of the title of the book length account. And that might cause them to rebel against post-history.
No, what is the last man again from Nietzsche? I mean, I think I have it's a non-playing character, right? That in today's terms.
I was trying to remember where this actually comes from in Nietzsche. I have a feeling it's from Zarathustra.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments. I might not give the best account of this because I haven't read that part for a while, but I think one of the characteristics would be that I guess overwhelming mediocrity, lack of no one sort of strives to differentiate themselves anymore. I think that's kind of what you were referring to, right? By saying that, well, if everyone's special, no one is, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, I don't know. Something that came to mind when you were saying that is, for someone like Rousseau, who really is like, I think that's where a lot of this stuff is coming from, like the whole stuff about recognition, right? In the discourse on inequality, right? For him, the danger isn't that this is kind of going to cause stagnation and the fact that, well, he sees the desire for recognition from one's peers as being unleashed in modern society, and that being, both a kind of potentially emancipatory, but also dangerous, right? Because it could lead you to set yourself up over other people, or to focus solely on differentiating yourself through the accumulation of wealth or achievement, sort of like whatever artistic, scientific, literary achievements, and in some way to neglect the whole or the general well-being, right? It's like it's a potential problem of living in a commercial society, which he will then address, a potential solution to that in the social contract.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the case that there's no in a situation where everyone is recognized as having rights just by being a person, as opposed to by being a member of a certain caste or belonging to a certain family. It's not necessarily the case that then means people don't seek to differentiate themselves. Right? Actually, the original worry was that, like, in some way that would unleash that. People would sort of no longer know their place in the way that they did in traditional society,
Right.
which is potentially dangerous.
Yeah, that's where you get the competition that defines our society, is from the need to now differentiate yourself from others, because no one is assured of recognition any longer, or the recognition they can get is in some way unsatisfactory.
Well, it's something you would only do if you thought you could be recognized by other people, right?
Right.
To gain recognition in society previously wasn't a, that was not a possibility for many people. Right?
I'll tell you something. I'm gonna tell you a personal anecdote, and I don't know if you can do anything with it. But when I started writing fiction, I was sure that if I could simply get published in a major magazine, that I would be recognized. I would feel better. I would finally accomplish what I needed to accomplish and come of age, be a real person in society. And what I discovered was that as I met the people who were in charge of deciding whether or not I got published, and as I got published, I no longer could get the recognition I desired in this way. And so that somehow as it proceeded along, the recognition continued to elude me. And I think that this is actually the fate of most artists and writers today, that they never can really achieve the recognition they're seeking through their work.
Is that a problem though? I feel like we would have lost a lot of significant art if people had written their first book and felt like they got the recognition they deserved and they were satisfied. Right. I think many careers would have stopped short.
Yeah. Well, what happens though is that there's another way to stop, which is you say, basically, all of these people are idiots. Why should I bother to write for them? Pearls before swine, that kind of thing. I've not reached that point, but there are moments where, that temptation is there, but I always recognize it as a projection of my own insecurity about my work rather than actually a real accounting of the potential audience or gatekeepers. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to point out that there is no way to fully arrive at recognition, and from my experience.
Right. I mean, maybe you want to, we're sort of talking about a couple of different things at the same time, right? There's a more social psychological notion of recognition. And then there's the sort of more abstract version, which is just to say that everyone in society is recognized as a person with rights who is a sort of potential citizen. Right. So why is that? That's not just a extension of something that existed before, but it actually changes the character then of, if you proceed from that and try and legislate in a way that is appropriate for everyone in society, that changes the content of that law, right? This is a kind of like paraphrased recapitulation of part of Rousseau, right? It's not just, the general will has a specific content to it that is determined by the fact that it is the will of like everyone, right? Whereas, in a society where only one person is recognized as really free, like that's going to change your conception of what is I don't know what the law should be, right?
Yeah.
Or you're going to have a system where people have different rights and privileges depending on like their position, right? You don't have universal law. I think this is what Fukuyama's working with. Whether it's true that somehow like that's enough, or that hasn't become problematic in some way, is another question. But I think he's drawing on something important. And yeah, I don't know.
I just want to point out that obviously this problem of recognition has come up in society over and over and over again. I mean, there's a Kurt Vonnegut short story about a society where no one is allowed to excel so that everyone can be equal. And if you're born really strong, you have to wear weights on your legs and arms. Or if you're got great vision, then they put blinders on you. And anyway, so I forget the name of that short story, but there's the popular Pixar movie, The Incredibles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is all about how superheroes were officially banned because they were too powerful and too different and too exceptional and gained too much recognition, and for the sake of society they had to be stopped. And so then they end up reemerging in the movie. There are lots of ways in which this question of recognition.
I think I watched The Incredibles 2 fairly recently, and I was thinking about this, right? Because I was wondering, like, is this a sort of bad egalitarianism, or is there something to the point that they like made themselves into a vigilante force, kind of separate from the rest of society, and not subject to the laws? Like, maybe they were right. Maybe I don't know. If we really had superheroes, I'm not sure what we would do with that. But I don't know. I would just say, like, the concept of recognition that's being worked with here is obviously tied to, it is egalitarian in the sense that it should apply to everyone. But that's not the same as saying everyone should be equal in their, like, physical, psychological characteristics or whatever, or that somehow everyone should do the same thing, right? Like the point is that form of recognition people are subject to that despite the fact that they're all different.
Right. But I mean, in the case of superheroes, or let's say a spy, there are rights and freedoms that you can get if you're 007 that you cannot get if you're not. James Bond has a license to kill, right?
Right.
No,
but he was a member of the Secret Service.
Right.
I mean, I think he was.
Maybe I'm pointing to another problem. and not just something intrinsic to the question of recognition here. But
I think maybe if they gave that to him because he was from the famous Bond family, then we'd be dealing with a different problem. But yeah.
Well, what if they give it to him because he was born with superpowers and had the responsibility of fighting crime, and therefore the freedom to kill?
I don't know. What are you asking me?
I don't know. I'm not sure what I have
done in that case.
Yeah. No, but look, but the thing is, these are questions that we're asking as society. This is how we are. One way we're thinking about the problem of recognition in society. Maybe it's maybe it's just false consciousness or what have you. But but there is a feeling that because we believe in a meritocracy, I think there's a feeling
did you not see this survey that said that 69% of I think Americans or maybe young Americans don't believe in the American dream?
Oh, well,
I mean, maybe. Okay, let's put this on the table. Like maybe one of the problems today could be a feeling that you can't differentiate yourself as an individual through your work, right? That really the problem, in some way, like an abstract recognition of your status as a citizen isn't enough. You want to be recognized for your contribution to society through your labor. And that is really problematic, right? And that can, that could take the form of like, I started thinking about Ben Studebaker and like this category of fallen professionals, right? That you've like studied for you thought you were going to achieve a certain position in society and differentiate yourself through your intelligence and your learning, and then you realize that there was no place for that. You couldn't. There just isn't. That role is not actually available to you.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that category, because I think it indicates something has been lost, that is taken up quite the way that it is now. Because in my day, and even before my time in the 20th century, it was sort of thought to be a truism that to fully be self-developed and contribute to society on your own terms would mean that you would possibly fail to get recognized by the mass culture or by society at large. That you would, you'd have to develop a counterculture, some sort of scene within society that would recognize your work rather than expect mass recognition, and that, perhaps your day job would never be the work that gave you the recognition that you wanted. That's, as artists, that's what people often will end up accepting. Everyone would like to be the professional artist and be recognized by society for their work, but many accept the idea that your work may not be fully recognized while you're alive, or perhaps only recognized by a small subset of society in some scene or countercultural milieu.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you use the category of a sort of mass audience there. I mean, maybe that's one of the problems, is that maybe the mass doesn't receive artworks in the way that the the idealized sort of connoisseur or judge of art that the artist has in their head might. I don't know.
Right.
And I mean, I think that's like been a broad problem since at least kind of like avant-garde and modernism, right? Like, I mean, certainly modernism has this problem of like, I can't have an audience. I don't have an audience. Right. Hence like it's there since Romanticism, and before, like the coterie and like needing to, distributing work amongst friends and little magazines and developing an audience and trying to create, people who could be receptive to what you're doing. Yeah, I mean,
but you're talking about the fallen professional overall, not just as an artist. So like,
yeah,
right. So
it was just one example of how I just think I'm trying to push back against the idea that like, oh, the problem is that we've like got everything we want, that we're like completely recognized in that sense, and now we're unsatisfied with it, because that does kind of come close to the more like, the stuff from Nietzsche, or the way Fukuyama uses Nietzsche, right? Which there's been a lot of like right wing or like romantic or conservative anti-capitalism, romantic or reactionary anti-capitalism, which is really a kind of anti-liberalism or anti-modernity, which has similar premises, right? That like, modern society has like destroyed the exceptional, or the, it has this leveling effect, which, I mean, certainly wasn't the goal, right? It was partly like to, the idea was to sort of unleash social differentiation.
Right.
It's partly what the division of labor is, right? Is that people will become different depending on what they do.
Right. So let's go back to Fukuyama here, because what Fukuyama is leaving out when he talks about things on this level is the way liberalism has been undermined by its own trajectory. And the way I'll think of it is just, once you have industrial capital and the dominance and wage labor being dominant, then the possibility for recognition for differentiation is reduced, because you get the category of unskilled labor, right? Or you get the category of work in service of a machine, which is a true producer. It has all the parts in it that, like, if you want to make a chair, what you need to do is know which buttons to press on this machine, rather than have a set of skills that you've developed, and therefore through your own work you can contribute to society.
I think that this was in my head earlier, that like, I guess that does show how there is a sort of petty bourgeois romantic critique of capitalism, which focuses on precisely this, like the craftsmanship and like, the individual being unalienated from the product of their own labor, like at the level of the workshop or something. Right. What I would say is that we should look at the category of liberal democracy and what that's about, right? Because, and I've discussed it on this channel quite a few times, the whole question of Bonapartism, right? That like, for Marxists, the category of liberal democracy is a problematic one, because it's precisely with the emergence of mass democracy, in democracy in the sense that we understand it today, that liberalism really comes into crisis. And they're not it's not coincidental that those two things come together. It's partly through, people want to exercise their democratic rights because they're no longer able to, feel satisfied with their recognition through their labor, right? Because it might not even be, they might not be able to get a job.
You've got a good shot. You don't have to keep adjusting the camera.
Sorry. It's so, that would be, rather than coming at it from this sort of empirical nitpicking angle of saying, oh, well, what about this, this ethnic conflict, or this terrorist attack that happened here, and doesn't that show that there's a problem with this account? We might want to say that we could try and say, well, he might have a lot of facts there that we can assent to, but his interpretation of the history from the 19th century is open to question, right? So,
yeah. Well, what would happen to our understanding of Fukuyama if we replace the word liberal democracy with Bonapartism whenever it came up? And because I don't think that would be an unfair thing to do. One of the problems that he does recognize for liberal democracies is how the development of the state's mechanisms can actually end up corrupting the state, not by being inherently corrupt, but by being too efficient, too successful, and too large. So he sees the growth of the administrative state as a potential way that the liberal democracy undermines itself. And I see a parallel between the growth of the administrative state and the growth of the machine and industrial capital. That you have this automated system of production or governance, which is not operating through the will of society or individuals, but on a technical basis. So that's another problem with, and I'm not sure how that's exactly connected to Bonapartism. I think I could explain that, but I haven't said it yet. But do you think that would be a fair move, as we're talking about Fukuyama, is to say when he says liberal, put Bonapartism?
Well, I think maybe not, because I think one of the things that we might want to question is, he sees the 20th century as in some way being a century of kind of competitor ideologies, right? So there are legitimate, plausible alternatives to liberal democracy in the forms of fascism and communism, which he actually doesn't market at 1989 or around that time, but he says that even in the 70s there's there's a sort of thaw going on. There's been a thaw going on in the Soviet Union since the 50s with Khrushchev. You've got stuff like Franco dies, there's the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, all these kind of mid to early 20th century, strong men are dying out, and those regimes are failing. So he thinks that at some point in the second half of the 20th century, these things started to be manifestly implausible. But I guess we might want to question whether that separation is a good way to look at things. That like you have liberal democracy over here and then communism over here, and they're like two completely different systems, right? Like it's an actual alternative. Whereas if we were using the category of Bonapartism, we'd be more inclined to see the similarities between like, you know, the Bonapartist state in the US or Western Europe and, you know, Stalinism in the USSR, or like, you know,
right.
the post-Stalinist state.
Well, I wasn't suggesting we replace the word liberal democracy in order to affirm Fukuyama, but in order to clarify what's really at stake, maybe?
Yeah, but I'm just saying it would have to apply to even the things that he sees as separate from liberal democracy, right? And he does, you know, one of the people he like is sort of fascinated by and occasionally refers to, but I think doesn't quite know what to do with, is Alexander Kojève, right? Who is his second example of like, so he says, look, Hegel said history ended with Napoleon riding into Jena, right? Like, he spread the revolution across Europe. That's it. Whereas Kojève says like, no, it's the 30s and 40s where we've really reached the end of history. And one of the ways he was trying to safeguard that is through the European community. So he becomes a bureaucrat. But what was implied in that is that fascism and communism were not legitimate competitor ideologies. They were just manifestations in a different form of the same underlying principle, right? That you know, Stalinism and fascism were kind of mass democratic in a way that meant they also fulfilled this idea of what he calls the universal homogeneous state. And maybe he had a point over Fukuyama, that like there isn't some absolute distinction between, you know, communism and liberal democracy in the 20th century that means that we can only really say that the latter has triumphed once the Soviet Union's fallen apart. So I think, yeah, I think that's why I would be hesitant to just substitute it in, because it would have to apply to everything, basically. Which doesn't mean that, you know, there is no difference between the US during the Cold War, you know, but like that the underlying problem isn't different. Like, you know, is fascism really a some kind of atavistic revival of, you know, the ancient German Reich? Is it like some leftover from the aristocratic age or something? No, like it's a product of capitalism, and so in some sense of
mass democracy,
bourgeois society, ultimately. So I think, yeah, that's kind of his Cold War inheritance, I think, which is unfortunate. But he does sort of like, he does work against that himself. Like I said, that he recognizes that, you know, the sort of thaw in the Soviet Union, like peaceful coexistence, competition with the West, does mean that it's imbricated with you know, it's just part of this global, it's part of global society, which means that it's not shut off from the same dynamics that he sees gradually pushing everywhere towards some form of liberal democracy, which I think is that's a worthwhile insight against some kind of caricature anti-imperialism that says that no, this was like a socialist society that was working on completely different principles and was somehow outside of, that the world was really divided into 2 or 3 great blocks that didn't really have anything to do with each other.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So the question for me, like when you first told me you wanted to talk about this, you suggested that perhaps we will end up embracing Fukuyama in a way that many on the left have not. The Alpha Bunga Bunga gang has this premise or this theory that we're at the end of history. Right? So history has restarted, I guess. And you want to say, no, we should take up Fukuyama seriously and give him credit where credit is due. So when I think about how to do that, there's a pessimistic version of how to do that, and there's an optimistic version of how to do that arises in my mind. One is the pessimistic version is to maybe what pushed me to suggest we just replace the term liberal democracy with Bonapartism, right? To say, well, since Stalinist Russia or Soviet Union was really just mass democracy, and it might not be that distinguishable from what we call liberal democracy, then we could say that we only have Bonapartism for as far as the eye can see, and in that way, history is ended because there's no challenge to that form of government. That's the pessimistic version. The optimistic version is to say, no, even when it comes to different forms of Bonapartism, the form that has the advantage is the more bourgeois, more liberal version, and that on that basis we might expect for freedom to remain on some level as a not only really existing freedoms and as we might experience it in the United States or Europe, but also the potential for freedom to be expanded will remain. The potential for freedom to be the political aim of society and through maybe left movements and things like that might remain if Fukuyama is correct. Which would mean rejecting the notion that not that the history has ended, but that it ought to end. This would be saying, there might be a competitor to this version of government that will emerge not separately or as an other to liberal democracy, but through it. So those are my two, my pessimistic approach to Fukuyama and my optimistic one.
I think with all the caveats on the notion of liberal democracy that what he was calling liberal democracy isn't necessarily very democratic, and it's certainly not very liberal. I would say, I'm not sure if the first one is that pessimistic, because on his account, the alternative is, either it's just something we haven't thought of yet that emerges as a legitimate competitor. But, it seems like most of the time it would mean the return of something worse. Right? And I think that's like when a lot of people are talking about the end of history having ended, that's what they normally mean, right? It's not what the Alpha Bunga Bunga guys mean. Although I do wonder what do they think has emerged that, I should read their book. What do they think has emerged that isn't within the framework of liberal democracy broadly conceived as, or conceived in Fukuyama's sense in the last, couple of decades? I find it hard to, normally that's an that's like an alarmist way of looking at things, right? That like so-called populism as represented by Trump is.
I published that book, The End of History,
Yes.
but it's been a while. But my understanding of it is that nationalist populism has emerged.
Right, which is apparently completely outside the bounds of liberal democracy, which I think is
neoliberal democracy.
Is implausible. Right. I mean, I think there's an implicit argument that, well, what Fukuyama was describing was just neoliberalism. Right. So the end of neoliberalism means the return of history.
Right.
I don't, I think we should.
That's wrong because Fukuyama points back before in 1989.
He points way back. He kind of says maybe Hegel was right, that it all happened at Jena, or maybe Kojève was right, and I'm just coming back and saying, hey, we should think about this again. Right. It does, like, every time it comes back, it feels like it's more true. But yeah, I think it's an unfortunate kind of anti-Trump, anti-populist political science way of looking at what has happened over the last decade to say that this is somehow a fundamental challenge to, liberal democracy, right? That we are witnessing an unprecedented new authoritarianism that, would be liberal in the sense of having, no concern for like law or civil liberties, right? Which we might want to say, insofar as it does trample on those things, it's just not that different from what we've had for, it's not different at all, but it's not differentiated in the fact that it isn't perfectly liberal, because that hasn't been the case for a long time.
Right. I would just say that the Alpha Bunga Bunga people are not so simple as to be pro-Trump, right?
Right.
To be, right. So they would call Trump a postmodern politician, a politician on the side of the end of history, the continuation of neoliberalism, and the nationalist populism. You can just barely make it out, and might maybe in something like the Corbyn movement, maybe in the Sanders campaign, maybe in some of the arguments for Brexit, but not the result of the Brexit vote necessarily.
I think what they care about is the return of politics, supposedly, right? That insofar as they identify the end of history with neoliberalism, they see it as being characterized by like political deactivation, the faith in, trade and international trade agreements and international frameworks as a kind of substitute for politics. Also like supranational institutions like the EU, which, Fukuyama is in favor of. I think that's the main things they pick out from him. So the step away from that then seems like, and a supposed return to politics, is what for them means it's the end of history. I think if I have got that impression.
But that is, even though he supports the EU, for Fukuyama, that is not, politics fits within his conception of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a form of politics.
There are plenty of things that get pointed out to him to say that, like, well, there's a problem happening here. This seems like the system is fundamentally unstable or leads to bad outcomes. And he just says often, well, that's nothing, like, there are policy fixes to that, right? And so implicitly, politics will be involved in some way. Now, it might not be politics as we might imagine it as socialists. It's sort of capitalist politics, but he isn't entirely apolitical or technocratic. He allows for a lot of things within this framework. And maybe that is something that we should be suspicious of, because, maybe he's just constantly trying to not admit that he was wrong or something. But no, I think it was implicit from the start that, it wasn't as if there were going to be no changes of governments and debates over policy and, disagreements, and that everything would just be kind of, apolitical, technocratic. No, that's why it's liberal democracy, right? He does criticize those kind of authoritarian. He's thinking about, like, attempts at what political scientists might call, like, authoritarian modernization in East Asia and other places, right? Where the ideology is that we're going to delay giving people their democratic and political rights in order that we can focus on economic development, right? And he's clear. He has a weird sympathy for that insofar as he thinks they were successful to a degree of actually getting that, but then that they will inevitably not be able to sustain themselves because they aren't democratic. Which I'm not sure I can entirely disagree with that, right? We might want to say, it comes back to what you were saying, the second half of what you were saying, that there is a difference between the US and China, right? Mm-hmm. Even if we want to say that China isn't China isn't socialism, China isn't communism, China isn't some different civilizational principle. It is the same kind of thing. Nevertheless, it might be the case that there is more potential in society in the US because there isn't this, the political establishment is less brittle. It can handle challenges and changes. And so people are more able to sort of experiment in society. Whereas that's very suppressed in China. I don't know if, yeah.
Yeah, you can see that in Fukuyama himself in a way, because during the last decade, I recall Fukuyama championing Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, and being a sort of soft advocate for not Bernie Sanders himself, but for a more redistributive form of politics. And even he was somewhat critical of the administrative state and the bloat of the administration.
So, I think he said at some point we need socialism, right? But right. For him, that doesn't mean, oh, I've acknowledged that history hasn't ended. Like, this is a new, he's like, well, it's socialism within liberal democracy, right? Like,
yeah, it's
the nice the nice form. It's
more public libraries, more
redistribution, and
right.
you could argue with that. He sees the problem of inequality and wants to do something about it. I don't think it's him suddenly admitting that, like, the telos of history was communism all along.
Right.
No. Which kind of what he's he's contending with that Stalinist view of history, partly, when he writes the first book. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I just recall, again, about a decade ago, when Zizek said we're all Fukuyamists now. That we all, whether we're social democrats or communists or Republicans or Democrats, we all basically accept Fukuyama's proposal that we're living after the end of history. And he said that in his usual way, both wanting to work well within that framework, not to challenge it, but also to challenge those who would pretend to challenge it. And whenever he did that, it would always seem to me that he was trying to point the left beyond it, Fukuyama, without ever really putting forward anything that would go beyond the Fukuyama frame himself. But so it was only when he operated negatively that he seemed like a radical to me, or like he was challenging the foundation of society.
Yeah, I think it's a good provocation. I just think, just to go back to the first few minutes or so, I think if you take that to mean that there are no plausible competitors to liberal democracy in the sense that Fukuyama means it, whether we want to say that liberal democracy is liberal democratic, then I don't know if we can argue with that. I don't know if it helps us to say that that is the case. I mean, we might hope it would be otherwise and hold out the possibility that, something else will emerge, but I'm not sure if there is an option out there on the menu to choose.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Let's leave it there. We talked for an hour and 15 minutes. That's a good place to end it. And I'm going to end the recording right there.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.